All right, I think most of us are back. We have a good audience online also. Welcome to this session 2 of the ACT and CCDCOE workshop on Cyberspace Strategic Outlook 2030. And this session will examine the objectives and activities of key state actors in cyberspace, their rationale, their doctrinal thinking, and the means and methods they employ, and also the trends to look out for. My name is Kadri Kaska. I'm the head of the CCDCOE law branch and will be the moderator for the session. And it is my great pleasure to welcome our 3 panelists. Laura Brent from the Center for New American Security. Hello, Laura. Justin Sherman from the Atlantic Council. And Janis Sarts from the NATO Stratcom COE in Riga. And I will briefly introduce them then all when they begin to speak. And a note for the participants, please use the chat box to send in your questions. You can start doing that already during the presentations and the introductory remarks, if you like. And then we will spend the second half of the session to dive deeper into the discussions. But now to the first speaker. So Laura Brent is a senior fellow in the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She has previously served on the NATO international staff, developing and implementing cyber defense policy, and prior to that at Ernst & Young, where she led and supported cybercrime investigations and cybersecurity assessments. She has furthermore served at the US Department of Homeland Security in what is now the CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, advising senior leaders on a broad range of national and homeland security topics. And her writings have appeared in the NATO Review, Military Technology, and the Three Swords magazine. So welcome, Laura. The floor is yours for your intervention and to get us into the discussion.
Good morning. Or good afternoon, sorry, good morning here from me in Washington. This is actually my first presentation with Center for New American Security, and I'm excited that it's here at the CCDCOE. As you just heard, most recently I was on the NATO international staff, and so the last time I was in Estonia was for Cyber Coalition in 2019. So what I'm covering today, sort of China's doctrinal thinking and tactics regarding cyberspacing technology, is a gigantic topic, probably for a book, even, much less a 7-minute presentation. So I'm really trying to focus, since I'm trying to focus not only on what's today, but what might be coming, I would say that this is very high level, that this isn't necessarily about, China's specific tactics to obfuscate its role in malicious cyber activity, but rather its overall approach to these issues. So I'm going to focus on the Chinese government's approach to cyberspace and emerging technology, what these activities suggest about the government's aspirations for cyberspace and beyond in the coming years, and fundamentally how this matters for NATO as an organization and allies individually. And I will try to keep it brief so that we have more time for questions. So I would say first, though, it's important to spend perhaps just a minute on how does the Chinese government perceive the importance of cyberspace and emerging and disruptive technologies. Fundamentally, at heart, the Chinese government holds cyberspace and technology as core to its ability to emerge atop the global order. When discussing cyberspace competition, for example, President Xi has said that winners will rejoice and losers will collapse. So perhaps in what the United States would conceive of as the civilian space, this means Chinese investment in everything from technical standard setting to manufacturing maturation, which I'll get into in a bit. And in the military sphere, this means a focus on not just informatized warfare, so very reductively what warfare defined by information technology, but now even intelligentized warfare, or similarly crudely, warfare defined by intelligent systems, not just information systems. So in short, cyberspace and emerging technology are central to the Chinese government's ambitions for domestic growth and international position. So what is the Chinese government currently doing with regards to cyberspace and technology? The Chinese government has undertaken significant activities in its framing to become a cyber great power. So how can we understand what this approach really signifies? First maybe to consider the big strategic changes, how they're getting at policy and doctrine, organizational concerns, and even resourcing changes. So as far as overarching directional plans and policy, I'm sure this audience is quite familiar. So Made in China 2025, focusing on increasing domestic manufacturing capabilities in key industries. China Standards 2035, so how China is seeking to improve its domestic and international standard setting abilities. Really in line with China's desire to be a standards maker, not standards taker. And then its military-civil fusion policy to really lessen the divide between the military and civilian spheres and leverage the whole of industry and government to continue improving its military capabilities. And of course, these activities mean significant investments in technologies from AI to semiconductors and other key aspects. And we've seen significant organizational change over the last 5 to 10 years. So in 2015, on the setup of the Strategic Support Force to centralize cyberspace, electromagnetic, and psychological operations out from the individual services. Also, similarly, the setup of relevant civilian bodies. So upgrading of the central leading group for cybersecurity and informatization to a central commission for the same in 2018, including the absolute centrality and importance of this topic for party leadership. The Cyberspace Administration of China is becoming an increasingly powerful regulator. So how are then these big changes actually being implemented, I think is worth a moment. So as far as standards, we're seeing more engagement in international fora like the ITU. We've seen the Chinese proposal for new IP, or the new Internet Protocol proposal, which has since been withdrawn in its original form, but was fundamentally arguing that the current architecture of the internet won't be sufficient going forward to support emerging technologies. While this was uncompelling to some experts, perhaps, it really did seem that this was trying to circumvent some of the traditional technical multi-stakeholder models and was instead moving towards a proposal that would have allowed more government centralized control over standards and technology from the ground up. Huawei currently has the most 5G patents in the world. Through the Belt and Road Initiative and the accompanying Digital Silk Road, obviously that's another way that we're seeing influence in standards and technology outside of China. And then, of course, continued cyber exploitation, I would note, for both domestic control as well as international influence. So we continue to see traditional espionage and perhaps something more disruptive with the Microsoft Exchange server compromise over the summer. And then continuing IP theft, and also some cyber activity abroad, but really to keep tabs on Chinese nationals outside of China as well. And I would also just note before moving on, there's been interesting domestic activity as well. So the Cyberspace Administration of China recently launched a review of the ride-hailing company Didi after its IPO in the United States over alleged cybersecurity and data privacy violations. So all of this taken together is a huge breadth of activity focused on, I would say, both now and in the future. How is the government seeking to define the technology space going forward? And, how is this really only the beginning of the debates? 5G has obviously been a hugely, contested technology, has been hugely contested in terms of what are the real concerns, how important, are they? And this is really only the beginning of the debate. So it will only really get more complicated. So what does this really mean for NATO and its allies? I would take us back perhaps to the North Atlantic Treaty itself, which states that allies founded NATO on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, and they seek to promote stability and well-being in the North Atlantic area. I would argue that some of China's activities are relevant to this conception of NATO's being. How can the Chinese government perhaps set technical network standards that are perhaps even antithetical to democracy? Are there security and stability risks in acquiring specific technologies from China for military use, for civilian use, what have you? I think always the fundamental question to ask then is, what is there to do? Timelines for this is long. These problems are really hard. The answers aren't necessarily clear cut. And as I would say, often some of the thorniest problems for NATO are they're not necessarily fully in the scope of the alliance. I would note NATO has already taken some steps to, include baseline requirements around resilient communication systems to make sure that includes 5G. To more firmly put China on the political agenda, to set up an innovation unit to get more serious about integrating emerging and disruptive technology, and continuing to develop policy, organizational, and technical cyber defense capabilities, which need to happen regardless of actor. And I would note that recently, politically discussing the attribution of particular malicious cyber activity to China. What should NATO continue to do is, talk to the EU about foreign investment, talk to the EU about national technology policies, consider what aspects of Chinese government policy are concerning in light of NATO's underlying values. And I would say also in light of its new strategic concept, what aspects of NATO are most impacted by this, by, the potential direction of the Chinese government. And I would say that individual allies, it's important to remember, also always have tools, whether that's sanctions, whether that's deepened involvement in the standards process, whether that's, more attribution. I would note that the United States, for example, has released some specific information about how the Chinese government has undertaken malicious cyber activities and how to detect it on your networks. And, finally, thinking carefully and long about how critical NATO and its allies believe this technology and, further developments around AI, biotechnology, both civil and military concerns to really be. Bottom line, and I'll pause here, and, China's made cyberspace and technology key aspects of its growth. Even if it doesn't hit all of its targets in its various plans, the level of investment and focus should keep these issues firmly on NATO's agenda. And even though I would say there are challenges today, they are only growing, and only by taking action now to think through some of these big policy and organizational questions will NATO position itself to address potential technological concerns and, foster responsible activity in cyberspace. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Laura, for this excellent sum up of the various elements of that illustrate China's exertion of cyber power in order to drive its broader military and geopolitical agenda. So, and I especially appreciated that your highlight of how that matters to NATO and the individual allies, and how we can take practical steps to up our game. My short question to you would be, when you think about the Western governments and military planners and commanders in particular in year 2021, how would you diagnose their awareness and understanding of the issues of China's strategic agenda, about the impact to our own security and defense?
So I would see this as sort of a two-part issue. So I would say, number one, there is, what do you need to do today for good network defense, for appropriately responding to any threat, whether that's from a nation state, whether that is from a criminal organization or an individual. So I think, in that light, you can actually be somewhat agnostic about what the Chinese government might be doing now or in the future. But it's clear with the level of activity, more focus, more attention, more skills, more clarity, I would say, from intelligence agencies on the tactics, techniques, and procedures that they're seeing, so network defenders are in a better position. What I think, though, as far as the government, as far as military planners thinking about the future, I do think more of an understanding and focus, on the long-term game is important. I think that it's hard to think that far ahead. And at the same time, though, there's a question of what if we integrate Huawei gear today, but then there's the bigger question of what if new IP is adopted and the way we think about the protocols of the internet and the way information travels changes fundamentally. So I think that there's a timeline problem and also just scoping the potential for different outcomes. But, fundamentally on the technical network of defense, it's do better regardless of who's doing bad things. But on the more strategic front, I think it's thinking creatively about the long-term challenges and engaging far earlier than you think you might have to.
Thanks. It's quite a paradigm shift for many European countries in particular, of course. Thanks so much, Laura. We'll come back with the questions later, but now I would like to introduce the next speaker, Justin Sherman, who's a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft initiative, where his work focuses on the geopolitics, governance, and security of the global internet. Justin is also an op-ed contributor at Wired and researches at the Tech, Law, and Security program at American University, Washington College of Law. Previously, he was a cybersecurity policy fellow at New America. Trivia, but nice to know, the youngest in the think tank's history so far, where he wrote reports and commentaries on global internet governance, 5G security, US-China artificial intelligence relations. And he's also worked on New America's data and Great Power Competition project. He has also worked on cyber and national security issues at the National Security Agency's Laboratory for Analytic Sciences, research, technology transfer, and global data policy issues, as well as technical cybersecurity and data privacy issues at Duke University, and served as a fellow at Duke's Law School's Center of Law and Technology, where he co-founded the Duke University's nonpartisan initiative, Ethical Tech. He's authored multiple book chapters, written numerous articles, including in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, Slate, The Diplomat, and others. So we are happy to have you among us today, Justin, and welcome you to give the introduction on Russia's doctrinal thinking and tactics in cyberspace. So the floor is all yours. Welcome.
Yeah, great to be here, and thanks for having me. Can everyone see the slides that I am sharing here?
The slides are on screen, so they should be visible to participants.
Okay, great. We'll get started then. So I'm going to talk about, after that very great overview on China, about Russia's doctrinal thinking and tactics about information and the internet writ large. So we can just dive right in here. So first, some key takeaways. So the first is that there's often a separation when we talk about Russia of domestic internet governance issues and cyber conflict. When we talk about things like RUNET or the recent crackdowns on Apple and Google, that's often seen as maybe a human rights issue or a domestic policy issue and not related to cyber conflict. But as we'll discuss, there's a lot of entanglement between the two. The second thing to take away is that the Kremlin sees the internet both as a threat to regime security and a sphere to be weaponized against Russia's enemies. And so the ways that the Russians use the internet to fight and the ways that they clamp down on the internet sort of have to manage that tension. The third is that the Kremlin, particularly in the last 3 months, has massively accelerated its coercion of foreign tech companies in Russia. And so we're really seeing a crackdown from surveillance and censorship standpoints there. And the fourth point, which we'll talk about as well, is that implausible deniability, or plausible deniability, depending on what you want to call it, is a really, really important concept, both strategically and tactically, for Russian cyber operations. Okay, so the Russian strategic approach. So as we said, right, there's two sides of the coin. It's both a threat and an opportunity for the state to undermine enemies. A really central idea, and this of course goes with Russian propaganda writ large, is protecting the regime against what's considered hostile foreign information. This transcends everything from social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook to, if we think of events like the Arab Spring or color revolutions, or when Putin returned to office in 2012, where the Kremlin sees a Western hand, or it imagines a Western hand in online movements. Related, right, there's an emphasis on making sure that citizens don't use the internet to threaten the regime. So at the same time, for example, as we need global internet connectivity to launch cyber attacks, global internet connectivity is also a risk because citizens can use it to mobilize. And this is a really important one here as well, is that it's not just, of course, about state operations. It's about enabling a spectrum of proxies, everything from those directed by the state to those that the state encourages or enables to launch cyber and information operations, primarily against foreign targets, but sometimes against targets within Russia as well. Cyber, as we discuss it, is not a concept that appears in Russian strategy, which I think is a really interesting point. The only references, actually, if you read the Russian doctrines that you see to cyber, are referring to concepts that we use, talking about, European strategy, NATO documents, US thinking. And so rather than this notion of cyberspace, what the Russians formulate their strategy around instead is information and the concept of information security. Of course, as we all know, right, in the West, that's sort of used synonymously with cybersecurity. We're really talking about things like encryption, antivirus software, firewalls. The Russian concept includes that. It includes those technical defenses, but it also includes this broader, probably more philosophical idea of social and political stability, of regime security, of sovereignty. And so this is really important because in the West, we often think of the internet as sort of this new flashy technology. It's emerging, it's disruptive. There's very much a view in the Kremlin that it's just another way of sharing and disseminating information. So much like radio, telegraph, fax machine, you name it before, the state says, what are we going to do? We're going to control it, and we're going to weaponize it. So we'll run through a couple tactics here, and then I'll wrap. So one key area is state offense. And here we've seen blends, of course, of what we would call cyber, but also information operations. And I'll throw a bunch of examples we've probably all seen up here, right? When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, there was widespread disinformation. The military also targeted undersea cables that linked the peninsula and the mainland to control information flows. We can look at elections, the US 2016, France 2017. There were hack and leak operations and disinformation. And even the Ghostwriter campaign most recently, which directly targets NATO. In addition to spreading disinformation, the Russians have also been hacking social media accounts and email to send anti-NATO disinformation around as well. And then, of course, we've seen, I think also compared to China, a willingness to conduct more aggressive kinetic operations, as with shutting down power grids and other things. So that is significant as well. Another main bucket, as I mentioned, is proxy activity. So there have been a bunch of front organizations that get state funding. The Internet Research Agency is probably the most famous, but there are a number of companies, I listed a few here, that purport to be just normal Russian tech companies. They sell software, they sell computers, but they're actually fronts for the intelligence community. So InfoRoss is one that the GRU is running. Their Strategic Culture Foundation was another that the SVR was secretly using to launch disinformation operations. So you have seemingly or purportedly legit orgs that are in fact backed by the Russian security apparatus. You also have, this happens all the time, criminal groups that get recruited by the security services. Primarily, this happens through the FSB. And interestingly, these hackers are often found through online forums and through criminal cases. One anecdote, right, is that this has been one of the FBI's concerns with working with the Russians. There are some cybercrime things like child porn on which both countries agree, but there are cases where, we suspect that the Russians use that to identify hackers they can recruit, for example. You also have a bunch of patriotic hackers where the Kremlin says, hey, look over there, and the next thing you know, they're launching operations. This happened, of course, with Estonia and many other cases where there are groups that the Kremlin claims no affiliation with, but acts at the Kremlin's direction. And as with active measures during the Cold War, again, you could say plausible. In some cases, it's just implausible, but deniability is really important here. Even if it's just a few weeks where the Kremlin can deny an operation, that's seen as a value add. And the last thing here I'll wrap on is coercion. As Laura was just overviewing, right, there's a lot of technical internet control in China. That's not exactly the case in Russia. You don't have a lot of blocking of foreign news websites. You don't have a giant firewall on the internet. Instead, it's a lot of traditional coercive measures. We've seen a bunch of laws that back this up: website block lists, FSB surveillance of the internet. Recently, the Kremlin's been labeling a bunch of news outlets foreign agents so it can go after them. But, and I link this report here that you can look at for this, it's really old-fashioned thuggery that they rely on. It's intimidation, harassment, threat of arrest, laws that you don't know how they're going to be enforced. Recently, with the Google and Apple case, where the companies resisted deleting the Navalny app, the Kremlin sent armed men to Google's Moscow office. These men sat around the office all day with guns. It called representatives from those companies into parliament. It berated them. It threatened them with arrest and prosecution. So next morning, all of a sudden, the app was taken down. So, maybe in China, you would see the government say, we're just going to block that. In Russia, Putin says, well, we're just going to use guns and thuggery or the threat of arrest to get what we need. So again, the four main takeaways, right? There is entanglement. As we see a push for a domestic internet, for example, that's going to change how the Russians launch cyber ops. The internet is a two-sided coin for the Kremlin. So as with radio or newspaper propaganda during the Cold War, right, it's a blend of censorship and weaponization, for example. We see the coercion of these companies ramping up. And again, implausible deniability, heavy reliance on front groups in the tech sector, criminal organizations. That's a really big part of Russian strategy as well.
All right, thank you, Justin. I remember the Lev Tolstoy quote about how happy families are all kind of similar, while unhappy families are unhappy in each of their own unique way. So in that sense, it's interesting how you outlined both the similarities, but also the differences of the happy or unhappy autocracies here, and the kind of the love-hate relationship they have with the digital environment. On the one hand, being reliant on it to achieve their foreign policy and strategic goals, and on the other hand, limiting the access and controlling or exercising heavy control about the content. So in order to keep up with the schedule and the time, I would like to move on to the next speaker, who is Janis Sarts from our sister COE in Riga, Latvia. So Janis was appointed as the director of the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in 2015. The Stratcom COE provides analysis of advice and practical support to the Alliance on the topics of hybrid warfare and information campaigns, challenges in the information environment, robot trolling, trends in social media, and strategic communications in administration. Janis began his career in the Ministry of Defense a good more than 2 decades back now. He has headed the defense section of Latvia's delegation to NATO and EU in Brussels, has been a special advisor to Georgia on defense reforms and NATO integration plans, and served as the State Secretary of the Ministry of Defense in Latvia, where he led defense sector reforms and was engaged in developing the new state defense concept and encouraging regional defense cooperation within NATO and the EU. And Janis has also had a solid role in the cyber defense history of his country. So as the chair of the National Cybersecurity Board, he was responsible for formulating and overseeing of Latvia's cybersecurity policy and overseeing the work of the National Information Technology Security Incident Response Team, the CERT Latvia, which is an organization larger than its name, definitely. So warm welcome back. You're always been a good partner and a good friend of the CCDCOE, so we are happy to welcome you to this session.
For the invitation and thank you for having me. And of course, I think it's what I'm about to talk about quite nicely fits with just what Justin said about the Russian approach. And I'll start by a very simple kind of point, and that is that information warfare is nothing new. We know all of that. That is unlike the cyber warfare, which is a new thing. Information warfare is not. But there are a number of factors that make us feel that this is much more different than what we've seen before and what we've read in the history books, how it has been used. And in my view, there are 2 key factors that contribute to that. First key factor is that this different approach that authoritarian-run countries and democratic-run countries take to the information space. So in democracies, we value free flow of information, free expression, allowing people rather to express more than less. And we've had a decent set of rules and regulations in the normal media system that delivered it more or less. But authoritarian systems, contrary, have inbuilt requirement to control the information flow, to keep things under the carpet, which they want to keep under the carpet, and blow over proportionately things that they want to kind of everybody to notice. And that's also not new. But what is really new is that the information space, you all know, is changing. Basically, the public debate has moved away from the traditional media channels onto the online space, which of course offers a number of elements, that is different rule sets. This environment is at this point basically governed by a few social media platforms. And by and large, these rules that the way they define them are far more influential to the way the information flows than anything that national government has done. And of course, there are no boundaries. So these are the 2 things that actually have created significant vulnerabilities in democratic countries, both by the way the social media platforms organize the information, how they present to people, making them increasingly one-sided in their view of the world, creating numerous information bubbles. And clearly we've been able to see during the current pandemic how fragmentized the public opinion has become. And of course, this notion of not having real boundaries that allows anybody who is willing to actually use these vulnerabilities to their own advantage to undermine these processes. And of course, there are a number of technologies behind that. And typically, when we look from that, we see the key actor being Russia, most determined actor in the information space, and Justin already kind of talked about their hybrid approach, both looking at the cyber and the information as basically the same piece. But also we see China down the road as a potentially more menacing actor, but certainly not the most capable in a European theater. And if I have time, I'll explain that in a bit. But from a technology perspective, what we see, if we're up into the digital space, if we are basically having our societal debate on social media platforms, clearly anybody who wishes harm is going onto these platforms to attack the public opinion, to sow the disinformation, and to further create the divisions within a society. The tools that are being used are more typical kind of application of old school methods in the digital realm. That's infiltration, proxy accounts, et cetera, But from a technology perspective, what we find is really interesting way they work is so-called social media botnet systems, very much similar to the ones that a number of threat actors have in a pure cyber sense of the word. And unlike in the kind of pure cyber botnet system, these social media botnets are meant to actually manipulate the algorithms. And unfortunately, we've seen that the social media companies have been really very lukewarm to really have a decisive action on those things. So we've measured a number of times the effect from those botnets on the times of elections, like EU parliamentary elections, most recently in the during the US presidential elections. And every time we measured the services of those botnets, not only were available, they're efficient, effective, and the market was very vibrant. What is interesting is much of the global social media market is dominated by the Russian software, which of course gave them additional advantages in the realm that they can use. The other element that I would like to talk, and that is more probably going further into the future, is big data-based micro-targeting. You know the term that kind of using the big data available on large groups of humans to use AI to kind of micro-target these people with a specific disinformation or specific information to influence their behavior in real life, their choices, etc. It's a technology under the development. It's not fully yet there, but clearly it has a strong potential, and some of the experimentation we've done within the military context shows that humans are really very susceptible to these things. And therefore, my next point is, I know there are many elements to the big data from a national security perspective, but clearly from the cognitive security perspective of society, big data of a society is clearly highly valuable asset that can be used, especially as AI capabilities will grow throughout the decade, for really kind of having increasingly targeted influence operations, not as it is currently mostly for a large groups or segments or pre-established networks, but to the point of 10, 5 people with a very fine-tuned message, which tends to be effective if you get it right. Then clearly the next step, what we're increasingly looking for is so-called deepfake technologies. So faking the reality and posting that in online environment, either, you know, the picture is already like, you know, who's not done that, but increasingly the worry is about the video and the audio. The interesting thing is that technology is there around for some time, but we've not seen it used much. And the conclusion is actually quite funny. And that is because you don't really need a very deep fake to fool people. You can really invest far less manipulation and technology to actually make people believe what they want to believe. So that's a kind of awkward conclusion to have, but still we have that as a future threat. But in fact, people are much more manipulable beings than we think we are. And of course, ultimately, this combination of big data and AI is key future driver for information operations. I know there are many other applications for those things, but clearly we see that as a future trend. And of course, if we think about 2030, what we really are concerned is the onset of the AR and VR technologies, augmented reality, virtual reality technologies, whereas we see what kind of impact on the society the social media has done, which is quite a simple way of connecting people. Then think of the way the human brain will react and the abilities to influence human brain through AR and VR realities. I think that is the risk that is underappreciated. Of course, the other element about the information space is if you're a hostile actor, you can target anyone. So you don't necessarily have to go for the national security establishment. You can pick your piece of the society where you find the vulnerability is the most inviting, so to say, and choose to pursue it. In our expectation, because of this imbalance between authoritarian and democratic approach, and the fact that democracies have not really come up with the solutions to this problem, even with some regulatory kind of suggestions and et cetera, the amount of disinformation attacks is going to increase. There'll be more actors involved in that. We believe in next 10 years, Russia will still be being the actor with most risk appetite, but we will see increased emergence of China, especially as more technology determines the efficiency of the information attacks and influence. I think that probably will be part. Well, I will stop and allow the questions if there will be any. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Janis. I think what you highlighted, like your predecessors, that the West doesn't seem to cope very well with such an integrated adversary who considers law either a challenge or a sort of a pirate code, which is more like guidelines anyway, as we know from the classics. So we as the West have military and civilian planning and decision-making as relatively separate mandates with each of their autonomy, not to mention the division of topics and tasks between the EU and NATO. And the entire knack of Western statecraft was separating governance issues into segments and assigning different tasks to different institutions, inserting checks and balances is a very good mechanism for avoiding power concentration, and obviously a deeply democratic mechanism for serving our societies against abuses of state powers. But how can we then be effective against such integrated adversaries who have no such limitations without us losing our own values and identity as the West? Not an easy question to unpack, but one that I've been struggling with for a long time.
Well, I think we sometimes feel that the others are 10 feet tall when they're not. If I look at the kind of societal vulnerabilities, they tend to have actually much more than we do. The difference is that they kind of endemically try to control the space while we are appreciating the freedoms within that space, which I don't think we should sacrifice. But clearly, we have created vulnerabilities where there should be not necessarily a vulnerability, like the ways the social media kind of divides the society, the algorithmic kind of choices of what to present, how to present for the benefit of earning more income, having the attention of the viewers. I think there are fundamental faults that are our own responsibility that when we can treat. But down the road, what I'm worried is really we really don't value the societal data to the point where we should. Because I think, and already there was a reference to the Microsoft hack recent, I think we have to be much more, if we think about this decade that is upcoming, we have to have much better capability to understand and have a certain sense and control, hopefully, over where the data goes, who can have an access, who cannot, because I see in 5 years that data, at least from an influence perspective, will be a tremendous asset for anyone who cares and has the capability technologically to use that. And there's already a lot in the hands that I would define as malign hands.
Thanks. We have meanwhile received a question from the audience. Piret Pernik from the CCDCOE has a question for Laura, and I will read it for you as well. At the Brussels summit in 2021, NATO leaders recognized for the first time that China's growing influence and international policies can present a challenge to the alliance, and that China's behavior challenges the rules-based international order and areas relevant to alliance security, and that China's frequent lack of transparency is a concern. So do you see consensus emerging anytime soon among allies on how to approach China, including shared risk assessments regarding 5G or emerging disruptive technologies? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is, a deeply challenging issue. I mean, I'd say fundamentally, even within the United States, there's not necessarily an agreed approach, much less between the US and other allies on a bilateral basis, much less NATO at 30. What I would say, though, is I do see potential consensus emerging, but my real question is when, and is it soon enough? I think that, later this week, there's the meeting of the Trade and Technology Council, and already it seems like the EU and the United States are not necessarily in the same place on some of these issues. So I think that over, the last year or two, there was quite a galvanizing factor to focus on 5G, and there was tangible progress made, but do allies come to enough agreement to address these strategic challenges early enough to shape an environment that they're happier with, in 5 to 10 years? And to that, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to do big things with a large group of people. Consensus is challenging. I mean, I would say absolutely this is something both the EU and NATO need to focus on, but getting a similar sense of urgency and a similar sense of what the solutions are. Can people afford to not buy 5G? 5G from Huawei is extremely challenging, and I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Which brings me to the question of, with regard to Western democratic countries, are you actually seeing innovative approaches coming from governments? Or is it primarily the industry that is trying to contain the threats and the risks that they're driven by their own initiative? Or is it for the states, does it hold what Jim Lewis earlier said about our attachment to existing solutions despite the evidence of their limited effects? So, and I have a follow-on question to that, but I'll address that to all of you. So what is the sort of appetite of governments